morning. It's this next section of Timothy we're going to be jumping into, looking at these verses out of chapter 5. You can follow along in your Bible or on the screens. God's been showing us this vision as we've worked through chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, well, through the whole book. What does it look like to live in God's house according to God's rules? What does it look like to be in his household? And so this letter, 1 Timothy, was written to a guy named Timothy, who's this young pastor starting out, and the Apostle Paul writes it, says, this is what it's like. Here's the manager's manual explaining this is what the church is supposed to do. These are the outcomes, these are the processes, this is what happens in the church. If you're careful and you look at it, this is what it's supposed to do. It shows us how God's church and God's household give way to God's vision. Right? And this is God's vision, that we would be godly, healthy, growing people leading a godly, healthy, growing church. Right? That's what he's calling us into. That's what he's calling his church to be. Because when we are a godly, healthy people leading this godly, healthy, growing church, what happens is we send out more churches. We send out missionaries and pastors, and those churches begin to become godly, healthy, growing people leading godly, healthy, growing churches, and then those churches send out more. And that system continues to happen across the whole globe. That's God's vision, but it comes down to good DNA. It comes down to churches knowing that this is who God's called us to be personally, and therefore, as a whole organization, this is what he's calling us all into. It's that simple. And I think most of us on the front end, we would say, yes, I want to be a godly person. I want to be a healthy person. I want to be a growing person. We would say that. But then sometimes if we're objective, you can look at some of the choices we've made, and the choices maybe that we've made are not necessarily in line with being a godly, healthy, growing person, but they're maybe in line with some other things. Maybe we're making decisions based on doubt or fear or anger or numbness or hopelessness. The thing is, the choices we make, they start to stack up. And so we could say, yes, I want to be a godly, healthy, growing person, but if we continue to make choices that are not godly or healthy or growing, what will happen is those will add together. And pretty soon you wake up and you realize like, oh, all these singular choices I've made have kind of turned me into a person that makes these kinds of choices. And then rather than moving toward this vision of godly, healthy, growing through our choices and our lack of intentionality, we end up becoming somebody we didn't want to be. So you're built out of these choices. The truth is, you don't just make your choices make you. You don't just make the choices you make and that's the end of it, but really over time as they add up, you might make those choices, but eventually those are the choices that make you into who you are. The question is, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice, who is it that you're becoming? If you align all of these choices together, you add them all up, what kind of person is that producing? There's a movie released in 2017. It was called Glass Castle. And it was based on a book with the same name by a woman named Jeanette Walls. And Jeanette grew up in a crazy family. I mean, it's the most honest and heartbreaking and sort of surprisingly hopeful story you might ever read. This crazy family, they could have been brilliant if it wasn't for the fact that they were so constantly plagued by chaos. Her father was a genius of a man. He could fix any engine. He could talk philosophy and quote Shakespeare, and he could explain physics like a college professor. But he was also a drunk. Her mother was an incredible creative, an artist. She was passionate. She saw the world in a unique, beautiful way, but she couldn't handle responsibility or structure. She rejected work and reality. So the Walls kids grew up in like pure instability. They were moved from town to town to town, living in cars or boxes or abandoned houses, and very, very often without heat or without plumbing and without food. To show you the kind of life that this was, there's a defining moment for Jeanette when no one would make food, and so she took it upon herself to make food for the family, and she was 3 years old. And she climbed up on the stove that they had at the time to make hot dogs, and she caught her dress on fire. And she was severely burned. And so she was rushed to the hospital, and then after being treated, her father rescued her from the hospital before they could get billed. And this was sort of the normal experience for her, danger and hunger and neglect that would usually destroy most people. But somehow, through all that, she realized that a miserable start does not disqualify a meaningful life. And as she pressed into the next stages of her life, despite where she began, she said, I'm going to be the one who makes the decisions that shape me. It's going to be my choice. I'm going to make these decisions. Her own choices would be what shaped her into who she would eventually become. Who are you becoming? In our text this morning, we're going to see the kind of people that God wants us to become. And pay attention to this, because it's one layer deep. We're going to read this passage, and if you're not careful, you might miss it. You might think, oh, that's talking about something that's not important to me, or that doesn't relate to me. But pay attention. The heart underneath it, where this comes from, that's all you. It's all you. So I'm going to start in verse 17. He says this: the elders who direct the affairs of the church, well, are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For Scripture says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it's brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. But those elders who are sinning, you are to reprove before everyone, so that the others may take warning. I charge you, in sight of God and Christ Jesus and the elect angels, to keep these instructions without partiality, and to do nothing out of favoritism. Do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, and do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. Structurally, this passage is pretty straightforward, right? And so to just take like a really blatant look at it, it's how the church should be led and by who, right? Very similar. Let me break it out this way for you. There's kind of 4 quick sections. You'd have the elders who do a good job. They should be honored. You have elders who are suspected of a bad job. They should be vetted. Elders who do a bad job should be disciplined. And then be careful to cultivate and protect godliness in leadership. So those are sort of the 4 sections that this text breaks out to, if you're just to look at it and say, okay, what exactly is Paul saying? And if you've been in church for very long, you'll kind of realize this is pretty normal. This is kind of how most healthy churches go. Well, all healthy churches do this. This is what's instructed of churches, and it makes sense. But imagine if this was the first century, right? And you heard about Jesus, and you're like, yeah, I believe in that, and then you experience this work of God in your life, or maybe you're somebody who's healed by a miracle from the apostles, and you say, what is this from? How does this work? And they tell you about Jesus, you become a Christian, and they say, come on over on Sunday, Resurrection Day, Sunday morning. And you're like, all right, and so you show up, and they start telling you about what the Torah said and how Jesus fulfilled it, or they have a letter from one of the apostles. You wouldn't have this structure kind of built in where there's elders and there's, everything's volunteer-led this and organized that. You'd kind of have to figure some things out, right? So then maybe you have some people who are giving a lot more to the church in the sense of time and work they're doing, especially people who are taking those scrolls and the letters, and they're studying them, and they're saying, hey, I have a sermon about this, right? I have a teaching that I want to bring to the Lord's given me this. I need to share this with the church. And so now you have these people who are giving all this time to it, and they're doing a great job. And so he says, look, this is what you have to do. These people, why not, if the church needs it, and they're really good at it, how about y'all pay them, and they can do that, and then they don't have to try to split their time all the time. Now, there's a lot of great bivocational pastors, is what they're called, where they have 2 vocations, where they serve the church in a very heavy way and with a lot of involvement, and then they have another job that provides them pay. And usually it's because they're so poor or the church is so small, it wouldn't be able to pay them. Sometimes it's out of principle, but like the Apostle Paul, He would be a tent maker. So he'd go and he'd make these tents and he'd save up enough money and he'd kind of be doing that and telling people about Jesus. And then now that he has some saved up, he'd be able to go and he'd do these missionary trips and he'd be able to go and start more churches. And then he'd have to kind of stop and make shop and make some more tents and go back and forth. But here you see people being given double honor, meaning he's like, hey, why don't you keep them around? Now there's a monetary aspect to this, right? So he says people who do the preaching and teaching, they reserve double honor. Right? That's why my pay doubles every year. That's just how it goes. It's in the Bible, all right? No, but there's a monetary side, but also there's just this sense in when like people who are leading the church well, who are serving the church well, like that's a service. Like it costs a lot. And you might not, a lot of it's in the background, like, but I can say just from my own heart how thankful I am for these elders. Even if they call themselves pastors sometimes, it's great. They really are pastors, right? I'm glad you can't tell the difference. That's true. The time they spent in prayer, in the Word, thinking about the church, thinking about you, thinking about shepherding, it's a lot of emotion. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of late nights. It's a lot of meetings they don't want to be in and reading that they're assigned that they don't want to do. It's important, though. And in that, we can be really thankful. And I can just tell you from personal experience, but also because I just know a lot of people, not everybody gets to have that in their church. Not everybody gets to have a leadership that shepherds well and loves well. It's something we need to be thankful for. So give them a handshake, give them a hug. They might look uncomfortable, but they're not. They want it, I promise. Just give them a hug. We need to be thankful about that, and we honor them. We honor them. So this system is how Paul says, look, the church should have a culture that's generous towards the people who they need to be generous towards, that honors the people who are serving. That's just who you should be as a people. Right? I said this is a heart issue. It comes down to your heart, the next level. That's you and me. That's us. We need to develop a culture that's generous. We need to develop a culture that honors the people who serve. And at the same time, we hold this standard. A couple weeks ago, we worked through qualifications of what it looks like to lead in the church. Is that there's a standard that you hold. And everybody in leadership is held to this standard. There's no partiality. There's no favoritism. It says it doesn't matter what your last name is. It doesn't matter how much money you give. It doesn't matter how long you've done it. It doesn't matter if who your best friends are. None of that. All of that's going to burn. What matters is your character. Are you a godly, healthy, growing person? So that's the only way that you're going to be able to lead a godly, healthy, growing church. And so we have this standard that we all hold. And he says when there's people who are in question, hey, something's going on here. We need to look into this. He says you vet them. You look into it. You investigate. You need to make sure that this is truly upright and godly. That's the role of elders in the church. It's the role of the leadership. And at the end of that, he says, a pound of, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? This idea of if you can think ahead and not lay hands, not appoint people who shouldn't be appointed, if you can be careful and be thoughtful and make sure that the leadership you're bringing up and the culture that you have says, no, we actually value godliness above all those other things, above whatever else you're bringing to the table. Like godliness is really important. And if as a culture we value that and we validate that, then this is what's going to happen. You're going to save yourself a lot of heartache. It's way easier on the front end to be like, hey, these are the things we need to work on. Instead on the back end being like, okay, now we have to tear this all apart. Now we have to undo a bunch of decisions we made. He says you need to be careful. You need to not appoint people unless they're godly, healthy, growing people. Now, okay, I'm a nerd. And you're like, really? And I could talk about this forever, right? I like church leadership, ecclesiology, the way God's designed. I love this stuff. I write papers on it, read books on it. That's my spare time is reading books on ecclesiology, all right? I know. I'm pretty cool. But there's something underneath this. There's a heart issue here that is less to do with the mechanics of it and more to do with who we are as a people that would develop the kind of culture and develop the kind of impact and cast the kind of vision that says godly, healthy, growing people is our goal. Not just for us, but for all the churches. That's what we value. That's what we chase. That's what we hold each other accountable to pursue. And that comes from all of us. We build that culture here. You see it really come out in verse 25. This is where it comes from. Verse 24 and 25, he says it this way. The sins of some are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them. In the same way, good deeds are obvious, and even those that are not obvious cannot remain hidden forever. So he paints this picture here. He says, look, there's some people who are known for their sin, and there's some people with secret sin. And there's some people who are known for good works, and there's people with secret good works. But the point is, they're all going to the same place. Judgment. They're all going to the same place. Whoever you are, all of our lives are going to the same place, which is judgment. We all will sit under the judgment of God. And no matter who you are, man, woman, child, involved or not, bigwig or not, important or not, skilled or not, it doesn't matter. We all will stand before God, and we have to answer. Now, it's interesting. When we talk about judgment, some people immediately just seem turned off by that. Judgment, I was like, oh, that sounds really scary. That sounds bad. But what's interesting is that judgment is only bad if you're guilty. Judgment, if you're innocent, is really good. Right? You can imagine being in a scenario where you needed to prove your innocence, and the judgment coming back, and they're saying, yeah, man, they are innocent. They are free to go. You can imagine how good news that would be. Judgment really is only scary. It's really only bad news if you're guilty. Now, when we talk about judgment, we view it through our own eyes. We view it from our own experience. And as a Christian, especially foundational Christian faith, you have to understand what happens when a holy God comes into contact with sin, with evil. That's where we find judgment, right? A lot of us in our life, we experience judgment and we get this negative taste because what we experience is like moral superiority of some sort, where this person is better than me because of X, Y, Z, and so now they're looking down at me, so now I feel bad about myself. And that's sort of our experience of judgment. But that's not at all what the Bible means when it talks about God's judgment. It isn't moral superiority, that God's checked more boxes than you, that he's better than you, that you're worse than him. That's really not what it's talking about at all. God's judgment is this blazing hot overflow of his infinite love of what is good and right and true. God has this love of what's so right, of what's so perfect, of what's so holy. He says, this is how things ought to be. This is what's true. My holiness, that's the standard. That's what it ought to be. And when something infringes on that, when it attacks that, when it brings it down, there's something that awakes in God. And that wrath that comes, that's the judgment. And you've experienced just a molecule of this. You know what it's like to read a headline, to hear a news story of some heinous crime being committed, and there's something inside of you that just wrenches. There's something in that pit of your stomach that you say, I cannot believe. How could this happen? And there's this anger almost, right? That's just a molecule, because in you, given by our Creator, is a premise that says holy things are good. This is how it ought to be. And then when that holiness, that goodness, that innocence, that perfection, when something there is taken or attacked or harmed, you respond with the how dare you. That's what judgment is. That's where the wrath of God comes from. Tim Keller puts it this way, that God's holiness isn't like an arbitrary rule. It's like the sun. The sun gives life, but you can't stare into it or fly too near it. The holiness of God is that, infinitely good, but intolerable to anything false. If you think of how hot the sun is and how impossible it would be to even bring anything else into the sun, it can't stand it. It has to be pure, or it burns it up. Talking about you and me, how do we withstand the judgment? What does it look like if God's so holy and when sin is brought near that, what does that mean when I bring myself there? What happens when I stand before God? Because I have some things in my past that God should be pretty upset about. What does it mean for me? In Hebrews, talking about like the Father's will, and Jesus completing that will, where Father says, I want to rescue my people. I want to send my Son into the world to rescue my people. It says this, and by that will, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Think about that we came with the guilt, we came with something that would deserve judgment to fall down in a bad way, and that judgment is bad news. But then, because God moved, and he said, I'm going to send my Son into this, he's going to die for you. You deserve the death penalty based on what you have done. And so I'm going to send my Son to take the death penalty for you. So when God looks at us, he just sees the holiness of his Son. And now that judgment is no longer bad news for the Christian. This is good news. Now, instead of God finding things that he needs to burn up in us, he's actually in a moment of absolute grace, in a relationship with his children, saying, what here can I reward? That's what the judgment becomes for the Christian. What is it that I get to reward? See, judgment's bad news if you're guilty, but it's great news if you're innocent. Judgment is coming. Does that excite you or scare you? Depending on your relationship with God, you have to be honest. Standing in front of him judging your life, are you able to stand there and say, I know I'm forgiven of my sins? I know I'm forgiven. I know when I stand before God, I'm not going to be standing alone. Do you know that? Because if you don't know that, you don't have peace. You won't. You won't have peace. You have to know. You have to know today. You have to know. You have to cry out to God and tell him that you can't stand in that judgment alone. You won't be able to make it. You need someone to rescue you. You know that you're condemned in your evil thoughts and your wicked choices. You know that you need rescue. Do you know you can trust in the holiness of Jesus to save you? That's what Christians believe. Christians believe that Jesus lived this perfect life and he died this sacrificial death and he had this victorious resurrection, and because of that, we get to go into the courtroom, be forgiven because of what Jesus did for us, and walk out into new life, into a life we don't deserve. That's the good news. That's the hope we have. That's what it means to be a Christian. And the judgment of God actually secures that. Think about that for a minute. That the judgment of God coming down on Jesus proves that his sacrifice is enough. Proves that we're safe. Proves that we belong. Proves that we have new life in him. Judgment's no longer bad news. This is good news of new life. The fact that we will be judged changes things. Changes things because it actually gives you a very good perspective on grace. This grace, this kindness that God would pour out, that the innocence we could never earn is given to us, and now we get to walk out into this new life and live not chained to that sin, not chained to that bad judgment anymore, but now free to kindness, free to holiness, free to godliness, free to hope and peace. We could never have that before. We're welcomed into this thing. This freedom means we get to experience all that God has for us. It's a new life. It's a new hope. That's the judgment Christians get to live with. Not a condemnation. Nothing hanging over our heads. Because we're judged, it changes how we view life. Jeanette looked like her mom, the author of that book, and she had the mannerisms of her dad. But where she started isn't what shaped her. Where she started isn't where she ended. All that happened along the way. And so wherever you started, I mean, you were dealt a hand, and maybe you wish you were dealt a better hand. But where you started isn't where you have to end. That's a message of grace, is that God would rescue us from wherever we are and bring us into new life. And there's going to be these choices along the way that really shape who we are. I put it this way: when you're born, you look like your parents. But when you die, you look like your choices. You're going to be shaped by the choices you make, that they add up. And if you choose the life of sin, if you choose to fall down, if you choose the laziness, if you choose the fear, over time, bit by bit, this continues to shape you and turns your life into something you don't want it to be. And at the same time, if you choose the grace, if you choose to live in that grace, and out of that grace comes this obedience that says, I'm going to walk with God, I'm going to seek him, I'm going to actually pursue him, I'm going to follow him, that's going to shape you. That's going to shape you into a godly, healthy, growing person. That's how God works. That's how he changes us. And this life, motivated by grace. Ephesians puts it this way: for it's by grace you've been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. It's not about you, and it's not really about what you did at all, but it's about what God did for you, and now this gift you have leads you into even greater things in life. Here's the thing, and I need to point this out. This is an excuse that comes my way quite a bit, is that, well, if I believe that, if I walk in that, if I do that, I have to give up all these things. Right? If I follow God in godliness, it means I can't have all this fun I'm having. If I follow God in godliness, then that means I can't, what does that mean? Oh, I guess I now have to stop swearing. I guess I can't overeat. I can't be fun anymore. I don't know. There's all this stuff that says, this is what makes my life worth living. That's the conclusion at the bottom of that. That's the foundation to build on. My life is worth living because I get to enjoy these things. And the truth is, when Jesus comes into your life and he wrecks you and he turns it all upside down, what you realize is, these things are terrible. These things pull from me. These things don't improve my life. These things don't help me. In fact, what I thought I was getting was some satisfaction in life in these, and they actually were slowly pulling me the opposite direction. I don't want that to be me anymore. Here's the point, is that when grace comes and it's a gift, that means it's not a burden. People look at this call, this invitation for salvation and walking in godliness like it's this burden, but it's just not. That's not what we see here. That's not what grace is. The grace of God pulls us out of the gutter where we're eating filth, and it says, hey, follow me into this feast. Do you think it's a burden to follow that grace? Grace interrupts you and off to the side, and it pulls you in and says, hey, whatever insecurities that you're arguing with and listening to, they aren't true. Whatever thing tells you that you don't belong and you have to stay away, that's not true. Follow me inside to the feast. Is walking into that joy, is that a burden? No. No, it's life. It's goodness. We get to be welcomed into a place where we invest our lives instead of wasting them. This is a gift. It's fulfillment. We find purpose there. We find new life. We get to walk in this design he has for us. Our choices add up and they shape us. And slowly, as we continue to do that, you realize there's this godly, healthy, growing person standing in your shoes. We're being shaped. And so you want practical, right? I can see you guys are like, tell me, just where is this going, all right? Here's these practical things. If you want to take a step, celebrate godliness. Celebrate godliness. In your own life, take a look at where godliness resides. What are the things that promote godliness in your own life? The habits, the people, the relationships? Where is godliness being pursued? And you say, okay, this is important. I'm going to celebrate this. In our church, we want to celebrate godliness. We don't want to get sucked into using the wrong metrics that the world uses to generate success or to generate outcome. That's not what we use to generate what we celebrate. What we celebrate is the things that are producing godliness. We need to celebrate that because, look, organizationally, that's why we do what we do. As a church family, that's why we invest in what we invest, right? That's why a good example is the leadership co-op. Every other month, we get people together, we start talking about hard church things and leadership things. Why? Because we want to invest in this, because we take passages like this one really seriously. That says we need godly, healthy, growing people so that they can lead the church. And we say, okay, well, let's work on that. And it's worth investing our time. And yes, it does cost us money. And yes, we invite other churches, and it costs us money to pour into them. And yes, we're okay with that. Right? It's why we're building a building, because we need more room for all these dadgum kids running around. Right? We need to disciple them well. We need to have the place where we're able to give them a vision for Jesus. And so we celebrate. Like, that's a great thing. That is a great thing. Can I be honest with you? We're going to make no money off of that. We're not. We're also going to lose a lot of money on it. But that's not what it's about. Right? It's about celebrating godliness and the fact that he's giving us the opportunity to impact people. All right? It's why we do the women's event here and we do the men's event there. That man camp. That's why we're going to man camp. To set aside time to focus on God, to say, God, where are you taking me in life? How can I leave my family there better? That's worth it. And so we celebrate that. These are worth the things in our life. These are worth celebrating. And if I can just be honest with you, I'm really bad at this. Like, just being in all transparency, like I am not good at celebrating. Like, I would rather skip the birthday so we can get some work done, right? Like, that's just who I was talking to Caitlin, I literally scheduled a work trip over my birthday this year. Like, I got to go, right? I got something to do. But I'm bad at this. But what happens is we rob ourselves of the opportunity to be grateful. There are times of fasting in the Bible, absolutely. And there's times in your life where you should be fasting, and you should be crying out to God. And there's times of grieving. But there's also times of feasting. There's also times where we say, isn't God so good? Isn't it worth taking a moment and just celebrating all that God has done, all that he is doing, all that he's calling us to, and we celebrate. That's why baptisms go the way they go here, right? And if I get my way, I get a potluck with every baptism. And I mean it, because it's like we got to feast. We got to be a part of this. We got to celebrate what God's doing. It's important. And when we celebrate things, it teaches us how valuable they are. Another word to say that would be that we celebrate godliness because what gets celebrated is what gets emulated. What gets celebrated is what gets emulated. As we celebrate something, as a culture, as a people, we say, this has value, this is worth pouring into, we need to see this more often, and we continue to press into it. And it's true for our whole church, but I want you to even take it down into your family. What do you celebrate as a family? Right? There's things you celebrate. Oh, people get good grades, and people win championships, and people do this, and we accomplished that, and we went here and did that. Look, and some of those things are incredible and should be celebrated. Great. How do you celebrate godliness in your family? How do you lift up pieces of their life and say, hey, I can't tell you how happy I am about this? How do you call into other people's lives? Not even in your family, just in your church family. Say, hey, I've seen this growth in you. I just want to affirm that. I just want you to know, like, praise God. Like, I just want to celebrate that. Because as we celebrate, we then begin to emulate. We say, this is worth doing again. And it teaches us. And this is what I'm saying. These are the choices. These are the steps. And over time, they shape us into the kind of people that we want to be. They shape us into who we need to be. What gets celebrated gets emulated. You know, Jeanette ran away from her family. She became a teenager. She was about 15. She ran away. Finally saved up enough money secretly to get her enough bus tickets to get out. And she ended up she went to New York because she said, I'm going to save myself. And she attended an Ivy League school. She got in and she wrote. She's a beautiful writer, hence the book. She became a very respected journalist. She grew. She made the choices that would shape the rest of her life because she knew it mattered. You know why she called her book The Glass Castle? It's because her father used to tell the kids, you know, one day I'm going to build this glass mansion for our family. And it's going to be powered by the sun, and it's going to be this. And And as a kid, she believed him. He drew these blueprints, and this is what we're going to do. And in between skipping towns to pay bills, he would cast this vision of this is who we're going to be. As a kid, she believed. But as an adult, she realized you don't just make your choices. Your choices end up making you. And all the choices that her father and mother made, choice by choice, brick by brick, day by day, it turned them into a kind of person she didn't want to become. She knew she wanted more. As people motivated by grace, knowing that God has more for us, we can celebrate godliness. We can make godly choices. We can say, hey, all together, this is who we are as a people. This is the culture we have. I'm going to hold you accountable. You're going to hold me accountable. We're going to press into this. We're going to celebrate this. We're going to emulate this together. We're going to build the culture that says, I don't want to miss what God has for me. We pursue godliness together. Look, if you're not a Christian, and you're saying, I've never had this moment where I've seen the judgment of God kind of incoming, and I've realized that I'm not going to make the cut, and I need someone to help me. And if you haven't realized that, if this is kind of what you're wrestling with right now, I want you to come talk to me. I want to pray with you. I want to help you understand these things. I think it's important. I think it's the most important thing. And if you are a Christian and you're listening to this and you're saying, yeah, I do need to celebrate godliness. I do need to cut out things that are deterring my godliness. Then here's the thing. Make a change. Make a choice. It's going to shape you.